Good evening. I'm Tracy Patterson, Director of Alumni Relations at Rhodes College. Welcome tonight to our discussion of Dr. Jeffrey Jackson's new book, Paper Bullets, Two Artists Who Risked Their Lives to Defy the Nazis, about an audacious anti-Nazi campaign undertaken by an unlikely pair of resistors. The book was recently named as a semifinalist for the prestigious 2021 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction, one of only 20 books in the U.S. to receive that honor. So tonight is a wonderful opportunity to hear from Dr. Jackson, as well as Matthew Broussard, a member of the class of 20, who assisted Dr. Jackson with the research for this book. Dr. Jackson is professor of history at Rhodes and joined our faculty in 2000. He received his BS in history, summa cum laude, with high honors from Vanderbilt University in 1993, and a PhD in history from the University of Rochester in 1999. At Rhodes, he teaches courses in modern European history, cultural history, French history, environmental studies, and interdisciplinary humanities. In addition to Paper Bullets, he also authored Paris Underwater, How the City of Light Survived the Great Flood of 1910, and Making Jazz French, Music and Modern Life in Interwar Paris, both of which have been received with high acclaim, as well as several edited collections and numerous articles. In 2011, Dr. Jackson won the Clarence Day Award for Outstanding Research, Rhodes College's highest honor for faculty. Matthew Broussard is a Rhodes alumnus and a first-year law student at the George Washington University Law School. Originally from Baytown, Texas, Matthew graduated from Rhodes this past spring with a BA in History magna cum laude. As a student, he served as the president of Phi Alpha Theta, the History Honor Society, and it's now my pleasure to turn this over to Matthew.
Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to this wonderful event to talk about this very interesting book, Paper Bullets, Two Artists Who Risked Their Lives to Defy the Nazis. First of all, congratulations, Dr. Jackson, on making the long list for the 2021 Andrew Carnegie Medals for Excellence in Nonfiction. That's absolutely insane.
Well, thanks very much. It feels very insane.
Hey, but you deserve it. And I do want to say before we get started, we do have a Q&A function for this webinar. So if you have some questions for Professor Jackson, something that you hear us talking about that you want to hear more of, or something that we don't talk about that you want to know, please feel free to put that in through the Q&A function and we'll address it towards the end. But to go ahead and get started, first, could you give us an introduction to who these two artists mentioned in the title are?
Absolutely. So the book is really about two women. Their names were Lucy Schwab and Suzanne Malherbe, but I'm going to share my screen here and just show you a picture of them. I hope you can see that. Tell me if you can see that, Matthew.
Yep.
So they were avant-garde artists. They lived in Paris in the 1920s. They had both been born in the southern French city of Nantes. They had grown up together as girls and then moved to Paris, became part of the art scene. And they were friends with surrealists, friends with Picasso, friends with lots of famous and creative people of the day in Paris. While they were in Paris, or even before they got to Paris, they also took on some new names, some new identities, and they're much better known today by these other names. I'm going to show you here, Marcel Moore and Claude Cahun. Her name is pronounced Claude Cahun in French. Most Americans pronounce it Cahun. I'll probably switch back and forth between those. But Cahun and Moore is how they're often referred to today, and they're more famous by those names. They were, Cahun was a writer and Moore was an illustrator, but they collaborated on photography. And some of the photography that they collaborated on was really sort of, at the time, even kind of out there. It was very surrealist. It was, a lot of people look at it and find it very shocking, even disturbing in some ways. But they were part of that avant-garde art circle. And then in the late 1930s, they left Paris and they moved to the island of Jersey. And that's really what the bulk of the story is about, is their time on the island of Jersey. Because once they got to Jersey, they thought they were escaping politics and escaping sort of the drama of Paris in the 30s. But little did they know that they were walking into what would soon become a battle zone for World War II, because the Nazis came and the German army invaded and occupied the Channel Islands. Jersey is one of the Channel Islands just off the French coast. It's British territory, but it's just off the French coast. So it's a series of islands in the middle of the English Channel. And so for 4 years, they undertook an anti-Nazi campaign. They fought against the Nazis, they resisted the Nazis. And what's so fascinating about them is that they put their creative skills as artists to work in this anti-Nazi campaign. So they used their talents as artists to fight against the Nazis. And they were very successful in getting under the skin of the Nazis. And they were eventually, they were hunted for 4 years. They were eventually arrested, put on trial, put in jail, and sentenced to death. So it's a pretty dramatic story, and some really two sort of amazing lives that they lived.
Well, you mentioned it's a dramatic story, and that's one thing that really, I guess, catches my eye whenever I was reading it for the first time, that it doesn't read like your normal dry, frankly, history book. It is written, it reads more like a novel than a history book. Why tell the story this way as opposed to the traditional sort of dry history book route?
Right, the sort of academic
Right.
model for history. Well, a number of years ago, I sort of made a conscious decision in my writing and in my work that I wanted to really try to reach a broader audience. Academic writing, academic history is extraordinarily valuable. It really pushes new boundaries. But very often, academics write for one another. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I decided I wanted to, if I was going to spend all the time and the energy and in some cases the money to write something, I wanted people to read it more than just a handful of other people in my field, other scholars, experts in the area. So I made a kind of conscious choice to begin to shift towards writing, still using my academic skills, still using my talents as a historian, my abilities, my archival research. I worked in this book for 7 years. I had to go back and calculate exactly how long it took me, but I added it up, and it was about 7 years or so. And so I put all that work into it, but like I said, I wanted people to read it, and so that's part of why I've done it. And I also think, sort of as another part of that, I also think that those of us who are academics, who have training, who have the skill set, we need to be part of the public debate, part of the public discourse. Rather than just speaking to one another, I think we need to be out in the public realm. And so so that was another reason why I decided I wanted to write the book in this way.
First, I apologize for saying dry. Academic is a much more accurate, better word for that.
I'm sure I made you read plenty of dry stuff in my
right. And it was interesting most of the time. But whenever you are, and you mentioned, like this is one of the first times you're really embarking on this kind of quest to make it available to a wider audience. Whenever you are writing history, using the sources, conducting research like you normally would, but in this narrative format, did you find any, I guess, unique challenges that you maybe didn't expect along the way?
Well, it was definitely a transition, to be able to learn to write in this way. I really felt like it was a sort of retraining of myself. My last book, Paris Underwater, was also written in this same style, written for a broader audience. So the first book, the jazz book, was my dissertation that became an academic book. But then that's sort of when I made that transition. And so it really did take a kind of retraining of my skill set, because academics and academic historians are trained to write in a particular way. And so I think you have to just sort of look at the story in a different way, frame it in a different way, think about things that you don't normally think about when you're writing an academic book. You have to pay a lot more attention to things like the sort of typical things that you would if you were writing a novel. You have to think about character, you have to think about plot and pacing, you have to think about setting. You have to be much more descriptive, I think, to try to give people a sense of what it's like to be in this place at this time. All of that though is still based in the sources. And one of the things that I was lucky is to have a really good source base to write with, because Lucy and Suzanne, these two amazing women, left behind a lot of writing. So I was able to go into the archives and to really pull out a lot of stuff. And then I also spent time on Jersey doing research there. And so I was able to take in the setting and to be able to bring that in and to write about it as I saw it myself. It's a beautiful island. It has lovely temperate weather. It has lovely beaches. Their house was right on the beach. And so, I was able to bring some of that observation in as well.
that reminds me, I took a course at Rhodes that was all about the idea of based on a true story at the beginning of a lot of historical fiction movies. And, this book is all true, all based on history. But was that ever an issue, crafting the narrative and the facts? Did the facts ever get in the way of the good story?
That's a great question. And there were times, I guess, that, if I were writing it as a novel, I might have moved the story in a different direction or had a different
artistic liberty.
Yeah, right. Right. But it's not, right. As you say, it's all nonfiction. It's all actual, factual, based in, in documents. In a way, I was sort of fortunate because the story just had so many twists and turns built into it. I mean, it was already a dramatic story. I really didn't have to do anything except putting it together. I will say one big challenge, though, is that a lot of in the second half of the book, once the arrest and the trial happens and their time in prison, a lot of that material came from Suzanne's post-war memoir writing. And it was very sort of chunked up in lots of different little excerpts and pieces. So it was really like putting a puzzle together. So I did have to use some creativity in figuring out how to put together the narrative as she herself was telling it, because she didn't put it in a narrative form. So I had to kind of figure out how to actually tell this story.
The other thing is, you don't have another story to go on, unlike books about Lincoln or Washington or, name any other of those popular historical figures where you can find thousands and thousands of books. There are no books on this story. This story hasn't really been told, even though, the themes are World War II and espionage, which seem like a writer's goldmine. Do you have a sense of why there hasn't been any books on this subject yet? Like why you're the first?
That's a great question. I think there have been things written about their photography. So I mentioned earlier that they have sort of become known now. They were sort of rediscovered in the 1980s and especially in the 1990s. And there have been museum exhibitions of their work. There have been gallery exhibitions. And so people have written about their photography. A lot of that is academic. A lot of that is sort of history of photography and sort of criticism, art history. And that's really what people have focused on, because the photographs really are amazing and shocking. And I'll show some of those photos here in just a few minutes, just to give you kind of a flavor for it. One of the great, I should say as an aside, one of the great accomplishments I feel like in this project was that it allowed me to quote David Bowie, because he wrote a thing on his blog a number of years ago about a show of Cahoon and Moore's that he saw in New York. And he said something like, "I find this work really quite mad in the best way." And so I thought, I've achieved a career height as I've been able to quote David Bowie in my writing. So I think, so part of it then, the answer to the question is that the photography is what's drawn people. Even though, as you say, the wartime story is incredibly dramatic, people have really focused on the images. I think another issue is that the sources, like I say, are very sort of chopped up. They're very, it's not an easy read. You really do have to do a lot of work. I did have to do a lot of work to piece this together. And the material by Claude Cahoon herself, Lucy, I'm sort of using her birth name and her artistic name interchangeably here. Some of that work was published, some of her writings were published posthumously by a French philosopher who sort of rediscovered her in the 1980s. And it's very difficult. I mean, she was kind of a surrealist, and a lot of her writing is very surrealist. And it's just really challenging to translate and really challenging to understand what she's talking about in certain places. So, so I think that that's another reason why folks have sort of, steered away from it, is that it was sort of a heavy lift to deal with some of the sources.
And also, their role in the war itself is a very active one, which very much counters the sort of normal narrative, I think, that comes to mind when we think of the role of women, especially in World War II. Normally, we associate that with their role as bystanders or domestic support to the capacity that they could participate. So would you say that maybe they are more exceptions to the general narrative, or there are more stories like this that have yet to be uncovered?
Well, I think there are always more stories to be uncovered, and I think that's part of what the historian's job is to find those stories and to dig around and to listen to those voices from the past. women did play an important role in World War II. I think you're right. It's not as been told as much, although we're getting more and more of those stories certainly coming out. Women had an important role to play in the French resistance as well. I think another part of the issue, though, is that, you know, this is happening on one of the Channel Islands. It's happening in Jersey, which is not one of the major battlefields that we think about, even though it was actually quite important. One of the reasons why the Nazis came to the Channel Islands is that, and as I said, I think I said this earlier, it's the only bit of British soil that the German army conquered during the war. It was really strategically important because it was part of what they called the Atlantic Wall. So the Atlantic Wall refers to this series of defenses and fortifications along the Atlantic coast, stretching from Finland down through the Channel Islands, through France. And it was so important that Hitler received regular updates on the construction and the defense of this Atlantic Wall. So, so even though it actually played this important role in the war, it's not one of the famous battlefields or one of the famous there's not a lot of fighting. Once they take it over, it's basically they're just occupying it and controlling it. So I think that's another part of the story that in other words, if they had been in France, we might know their story already, because they would have been perhaps part of the French resistance, which has been talked about for a long time. But because they were living on the island of Jersey, I think it's just not talked about as much. I think the British talk about it more because it's part of British territory. They know maybe a little bit more about that. But certainly Americans, I think, don't know much about the story on Jersey.
Definitely want to talk about, their life in Paris in a second, but you just mentioned, the strategic importance of Jersey, so much so that Hitler was receiving regular updates. Why would they move there before the onset of the war?
Well, Jersey was a familiar place for them. They had been there many times over the years. The Schwab family, Lucy's family, had vacationed there for decades. And then the two of them went together and also vacation there. I can't remember. Did I mention the fact that they were also a couple? Did I say that? I can't remember if I said that they were also partners, that they were a lesbian couple. I may have left that detail out of the beginning.
That's a detail, yeah.
That's really important to the story. I don't want to leave that out because it's really essential to the story. So they moved there together as a couple. What's also complicated about their personal story, by the way, is that they were also stepsisters. Lucy's divorced father married Suzanne's widowed mother. And so they were a lesbian couple. They were also stepsisters. They were also artistic collaborators. They worked together. And so their lives were completely intertwined. And so in the context of moving to Jersey, they moved there together because, like I said, they had vacationed there many times over the years. It was an important place to them. But it was also a way that Lucy could escape sort of the hurly-burly of Paris. I mean, by the 1930s, Paris was a very deeply politically polarized place. There were proto-fascist groups. There's a lot of political upheaval in the city of Paris. The Depression was also worsening by the late 30s, and Lucy had some chronic health issues as well. And so the idea was that moving to Jersey would be a better place for them to live. It would be a safer place, kind of out of all of the craziness of Paris. And they could live together and live out the rest of their lives. The people in Paris knew about their relationship, knew that they were partners, knew that they were in a committed relationship. On Jersey, they, I think, tended to sort of obscure that. They sort of fell more back on the idea that, well, we're sisters, which was true as well. So it was almost sort of like the perfect excuse. They didn't have to explain the details about their relationship. Jersey was a bit more conservative than Paris, which was in the 20s, a bit more open and more friendly for a gay community. Jersey less so, and so they were able to sort of obscure that. But they bought a house there, and they moved in, and they settled into what they thought would be a very calm and peaceful life. They came from money. Money was not an issue for them, and so they thought, we'll just kind of live this peaceful life, and we'll do our art, and we'll just enjoy living on the island. And then a few years later, the Germans show up, and then they had an important choice to make. Would they flee? They thought about it, and maybe go to London or go somewhere else. Would they, or go back to France? Would they sort of sit out the war and do nothing, which they could have easily done in their big house? They could have just locked the doors and sort of sat by. or would they fight? Would they resist? And that's where the fact that they were a couple, a lesbian couple, really becomes an important part of the story, because they had been resisting for a long time. They had been resistors for a long time in their personal lives, because even though Paris was a more open place for a lesbian couple, nevertheless, there were plenty of people in Paris who saw that as unacceptable or as not respectable. In other words, they weren't universally accepted. They had also been part of this avant-garde art scene, and they were pushing the boundaries with this art and taking on these new names, these new sort of gender neutral names, right? Claude, in French, Claude can be a man's name or a woman's name. And so they were very intentionally kind of playing with gender issues in their work and in taking on these new artistic identities. So they had been resisting for a long time. They had that was built into their lives and their lives together. Their partnership was built around this kind of idea of resistance. So in some ways, what I argue in the book ultimately, or what I try to show in the book, is that the resistance against the Nazis was really an outgrowth of who they were. All of these kinds of ways in which they had been pushing against mainstream society, against artistic boundaries, against many things in their lives, then prepared them, it equipped them to fight against the Nazis.
So while talking about them, you brought up a lot about the sort of cultural space in Paris in the interwar period and the Surrealists. What was Paris like more broadly in terms of its cultural space during that period that they lived in Paris?
So they lived in Paris, or they moved to Paris right after the war, right after World War I. Paris had suffered a lot during the war. The City of Light had gone dark. They had to turn off the lights so that they could avoid being bombed by Zeppelins, for example. After the war, there's a real sense of relief, a sense of openness. This is the era of jazz, which I wrote about in my first book. Jazz becomes the soundtrack of this kind of post-war era as people come out and go dancing, go partying, sort of throw off the strictures of the war. And it is a more open place. It's a place Americans are showing up. American expatriates are there, and lots of people from all over the world. Russians who are fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and it's a very diverse place, very cosmopolitan place in Paris. Artists from all over the world. I mean, that's been true for a long time, but especially in the 1920s, people from all over the world, including artists. So there was a very rich scene. It was a very vital and vibrant scene for them. They were young women in their 20s when they moved there. They had family money. They also had some family connections, so they were able to kind of fit right in to life in Paris. They'd visited many times before. Lucy's uncle was a famous writer, and his wife, the uncle's wife, was a well-known actress of the day. So they were able to kind of have easy entree into some of these circles. And they met a lot of other famous artists and began to socialize with them and to really just sort of integrate themselves into that scene. There was also a gay scene, a lesbian scene. There were bars and restaurants and clubs and places where they could go and socialize. And they certainly took advantage of that as well and made a lot of connections there and really sort of got support for their relationship during those years. So the 20s in Paris, were very vibrant. Once the Depression hits in 1929, 1930, things start to shift. The politics starts to shift. And that's where you really begin by the mid 30s, you start to see the rise of fascism. You start to see in France, you start to see fascist groups who are coming in really very much politically polarized. You have groups fighting in the streets, literally between sort of fascist groups and communist groups. And that was part of, again, that decision about why they wanted to leave, is the political polarization of Paris had just become too much. It was too taxing, I think, especially for Lucy, because the chronic health conditions that she had, it just sort of drove her nerves crazy. And there was this desire to get out.
Whenever you are talking about their life in Paris in the book, the amount of name dropping is ridiculous. They had some friends who you'd recognize, even if you've never heard of these two people, you recognize these names. One anecdote I just love is them hanging out in Gertrude Stein's living room, just casually, like anyone could do that, talking about, literature and all sorts of politics and ideas. What were those conversations like, and how did they influence their lives later in Jersey?
I think they learned a lot in those Paris years. I think they learned a lot about art and about creativity and sort of thinking about pushing the boundaries. And in fact, I was trying to pull up here. Let me show, if I can, let me share my screen and I can, nope, that's not it. I've got too many screens here that I'm trying to share.
This was bound to happen.
Yeah, this is what my class is like every day. Let me go over here actually and share this screen just to show you a little bit of their art. And this is by no means all of it. This is just a little taste, especially for folks who are watching who've never heard of them before, don't know anything about their work. This is some of the stuff that they're probably most famous for, these photo montage. This is the stuff that's very surrealist. And if you know anything about surrealist art, if you've seen a lot of surrealist art, this looks very surrealist. This fits in with the kind of stuff that Salvador Dali was doing, who was also certainly an acquaintance of them. One of the founders of surrealism, André Breton, who was a writer, he became very good friends with them. Although at first he was sort of skeptical of them, but later on he learned to appreciate them and to appreciate their work. There were a lot of resonances between what the surrealists were doing and what they were doing. And often art historians will categorize them as surrealists. I think a lot of their stuff they had sort of already figured out before they even met Breton and some of the surrealists, but they certainly hung out with them at cafes and talked with them. The surrealists were also involved in politics, and a number of the other avant-garde artists of the day were involved in politics. And so that was another thing that they learned in Paris, was they became very political in Paris. And I think part of that was because of their own relationship. And for them, the personal was political because there were attempts to sort of curb the gay scene, to sort of quash the gay community. And so for them, that was an issue, and they wrote letters and sort of worked in some quiet ways to protest that. But they certainly, as you can see from images like this, they were really sort of learning to push the boundaries. And I think that was sort of between the politics and the creativity and then their own relationship, all of those things really sort of came out of that scene in Paris and equipped them to then, when they got to Jersey, to become the kind of resistors that they were.
You know, you alluded to the relationship with André Breton, and I found that part to be very funny in the book. You note that at the time he was a quote, notorious misogynist and homophobe, yet he developed this relationship with them and actually drew them into politics. What was their relationship like, and how did it develop given that, I guess, disposition?
Well, Breton was a sort of notoriously prickly person. He was a World War I veteran. He suffered from the war, probably from some what we would now call post-traumatic stress. A lot of the sort of surrealist stuff that came out of a lot of the surrealists had been in the war and were really sort of obsessed with questions about masculinity and the fate of men, the fate of masculinity after the war. I think that's a big part of where his homophobia came from, is that there was this kind of anxiety about, you know, the fate of men after the war, because so many had died. France suffered more deaths per capita than any of the other belligerent countries. There's this kind of a sense that a whole generation of French men had died on the battlefields, and so I think that was part of what was going on. But like I said, at first he was sort of skeptical of Cahun and Moore, Lucy and Suzanne, but I think ultimately he just saw the work and read Lucy's writing, and I think the light went on for him. Lucy published a book. Those photo montages that I was just showing a minute ago were published in a book that was essentially a kind of autobiography that Lucy wrote as Claude Cahun, and it's very hard to describe this work. It's not a traditional autobiography in the way we would think about it. It's very much a sort of inner exploration of her psyche and of her past and of her inner demons. She had a very troubled family life, troubled childhood. She grew up during the Dreyfus Affair, which is this very notoriously anti-Semitic episode in French history that stretches on for a number of years. And so she was scarred by a lot of things in her past. And I think this book was an attempt to try to uncover those demons and to deal with that. And so in the book, as she's sort of, talking about all these things, I think Breton sort of saw that and saw the way that she was going about that, as well as the photo montage, and really just sort of, came to realize her genius.
You mentioned the Dreyfus affair and how she grew up with that sort of environment in France. What was sort of, I guess, the atmosphere of anti-Semitism in France, and how did it affect her as she was growing up?
So it was very important for her. It's one of the things that would, of course, lead her to become a resistor once they got to Jersey, I think. The memory of that stayed with her for a long time. So the Dreyfus affair, it's a very complicated thing. I'm not going to try to do an explanation of it here because that would take too long. But it was a moment of sort of an explosion of anti-Semitism and big cultural fights and political fights over the role of Jews in French society. And it, in the city of Nantes, where the women grew up, it led at one point to literally crowds in the streets chanting "Down with the Jews." Her father was a newspaper owner and editor, Lucy's father, and he took a very pro-Dreyfus stance. He was on the side of Dreyfus, who was himself Jewish and who was falsely convicted for spying for the Germans. And so there were crowds outside the apartment chanting these anti-Semitic taunts because her father's newspaper had taken a pro-Dreyfus stance. So, and that was at a very young age. I think she was four years old when that happened. And so it was something that really kind of stuck with her and shaped her. So that by the time they got to Jersey, she was, predisposed in all of these ways and with that memory of anti-Semitism. And yet what's interesting about the story, once they do begin their resistance work on Jersey, which I guess I should start to describe what it is that they're actually doing, right? Because what the story of what they do is in some ways part of what's most remarkable about this. But let me contextualize it before I get into the details.
Of course.
But contextualize it with this question about anti-Semitism, because they of course hate fascism, and they're fighting against that. But interestingly, they see the men on Jersey, the soldiers, they see them not as enemies or the subject of their hatred. They actually feel sympathy for them. They feel a kind of compassion for these men, this occupation force, because they say, these are ordinary guys. They've been duped. They've been sort of fooled by Hitler into this war too. And so they see them, they kind of take pity on them in a way. And really, in a way, their resistance efforts are, on the one hand, it's about trying to convince the Germans to leave and go home, but not out of a sense of hatred, but rather out of a sense of, like I said, a kind of empathy that they have for these men. So really what they end up doing then, to sort of think about or to talk about the actual resistance work that they do, it's not violent. It's not doesn't involve any weapons. It doesn't involve any what we would think of as sort of traditional resistance techniques. Instead, what they do is they write notes. Those are the paper bullets of the title that they write. They write songs, jokes, poems. They write little bits of dialogue. They sort of make up this dialogue. They listen to the BBC secretly, and then they summarize the BBC news reports, and they type all of this up on an old typewriter that they have. And then they start to distribute these notes. They start to leave these notes around the island of Jersey. They'll leave it on it. They left things on a cafe table. They would stick things inside of a magazine. They would pin it to a fence post. And in some cases, they would even slip up near a German soldier and put a note in his pocket, so that later when he reached in his coat pocket, he would find a note. And all of these notes were written in German. They were written to the soldiers in their own language so that they could read it, understand it. And the whole idea there was to get inside the minds of the soldiers, to basically convince them that the war was lost, or that this was a pointless activity, and that they should go back to their families. They should go home. And I think that also kind of reflects the sense of, kind of taking pity on them. It's like, these poor guys are away from their family. Let's try to convince them that this is a ridiculous effort and they should go back to their families. And so I think it's a story that kind of combines a lot of different elements, sort of who they are, as people, and kind of what their background is, and how they approach that, how they approach the enemy with this kind of mindset of compassion, and then what they do about it. It's really sort of a remarkable story. I think I often talk about this as the World War II story you've never heard before, because I don't know that there's really any other story like it.
You know, talking about their acts of resistance, one act that really stood out was the soldier with no name. Could you describe what that is?
Right, the soldier with no name. I originally I wanted to call the book "The Soldiers with No Names," but fortunately my editor was smarter than me about this. I love Paper Bullets as a title, but the soldier with no name was a sort of persona that they created. So they started in these notes that they would write. These, again, it was all different kinds of notes, sort of little sayings, little slogans, like I said, funny jokes about Hitler, things like that. They would often sign them with this persona that they'd created. So they would sign it as the soldier with no name. And the idea there was to sort of fool the Germans who would be reading these notes, to fool them into thinking that a fellow soldier had written them. So in other words, they were not trying to pretend, or let me rephrase that. They were not writing with their own authority. They were not, writing as two French women living, as expatriates on the island of Jersey. They were crossing gender lines and taking on this male persona, and writing as though they were a German themselves. Suzanne was fluent in German, so she was able to translate their work into German. To me, this is also kind of an extension of what they were doing in Paris. These new names, these artistic names that they took on, Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, they're very masculine names. And so they were sort of playing with questions of gender already in their artistic work in Paris. And now they're doing that again on Jersey, when they cross that gender line and become, so to speak, a male persona. And I think that was what they really saw as sort of giving, that was the persuasive part of what they were doing, or they hoped that it would be the most persuasive aspect, that if they could convince soldiers that a fellow soldier was fed up with this war, right? And a lot of the notes were about, how the war was meaningless, or how we should put down our arms and go home. Then they felt like they would have done their job. As a result, of course, as you might imagine, the German command was extremely upset by this, because what they were doing was trying to undermine morale. So the secret field police, which was the organization that was tasked with keeping order in occupied territories, they literally hunted them for 4 years. When they started discovering these notes, they took them, they categorized them or cataloged them, and they started a file, and they started investigating, and they were trying to figure out, was this actually coming from a German soldier? Was it coming from one of the locals? They didn't know. And eventually they get found out in various ways, which maybe I won't reveal, just so that folks, if they want to read and find out all the details about how they get caught and how this works in the end. But it's, it's something that in other words, the German army takes this very seriously. It seems like a small thing to write notes, right? That was, to me, one of the most remarkable aspects of this story. How is it that just writing notes could cause the German occupation force to panic for 4 years? But they really did. I mean, they spent a lot of effort looking for them, and eventually they did find them. And when they put them on trial, and when the judge passed sentence, he said to them something like, "You are worse than guerrilla fighters," right? Because with bullets, with regular weapons, you know what the effect is, but with, as he called it, spiritual weapons, it's hard to predict, what the effect would be. And so he understood that it was something that was very dangerous. And morale was already bad on Jersey, especially as the war went on, because they didn't have enough provisions. They once after D-Day, they can't resupply the Channel Islands. So food is becoming more and more scarce. So morale is already weak. And then on top of it, you have these notes, and, it just becomes this very difficult situation.
It is kind of funny, though. I mean, their idea of going to Jersey and continuing to work on art and kind of live out their lives, that is, in a sense, what they ended up doing whenever you do look at their resistance as a form of art. So in that way, it's very poetic. But, you know, you do mention the effectiveness of this on German morale as its own form of warfare. And, you know, Lucy, as you mentioned in the book, had a sort of, I guess you'd call it a theory about this, the indirect effect. Could you speak to what the indirect effect is as she saw it?
Right. So she says, and this is back in her Paris days, she writes an essay in which she essentially says, and it's part of a debate, a part of a conversation among artists about what's the relationship between art and politics. And she says, well, you know, propaganda doesn't work because it's too blunt, it's too in your face, it's too, it's not subtle, right? It's so overt that people can see right through it. Instead, she says that art can have this indirect effect, that it can, you know, a song, a painting, a story can get inside the mind and can sort of burrow into your thought and can really change your perspective. And so that was really, I think, what they were trying to do, is to change people's perspective, change the frame of reference, not hit them with a sort of, you know, in your face, obvious propaganda message, but rather to say, you know, how can we plant a seed? How can we plant a seed of doubt, a seed of dissent in the mind of a soldier who maybe is already kind of missing home and doesn't really want to be here in the first place. He's not an ardent Nazi. He's not a true believer. He's not a, you know, ideological follower. He's just doing his patriotic service. He's been drafted into the army. He's just here because he's got to do his service. Maybe he already has some doubts or some questions. And so how do we plant that seed in his mind that's going to sort of foster him to think more, right? I think, to me, one of the things about this idea of the indirect effect is that it was trying to really kind of promote a kind of critical thinking, so that people would not just sort of be like, propaganda creates a knee-jerk reaction, I think they would have said, but this indirect effect, as she calls it, is trying to get people to think for themselves. And so when you read some of these surviving documents, and there are not very many of these that we have, but that they're sort of, they're clearly anti-war. I mean, don't get me wrong, they're obvious in that sense, but at the same time, they're these sort of, you know, ways of kind of, like I said, planting that seed to get people to think more.
And you mentioned earlier about changing the title of the book from A Soldier with No Name to Paper Bullets. Where does that, I guess, phrase paper bullets come from?
So the phrase paper bullets actually comes from the Allies. It comes from the Allied Psychological Operations Division. One of the documents that I found when I was doing the research was, I found a really great cache of documents about Allied PSYOPs. And there was a sort of a manual. And in this manual, it talks about, you know, what different ways that we can engage in psychological operations against the enemy. And one of those ways was leafleting and dropping leaflets. And it was referred to in this manual as paper bullets. And so I just pulled that title out. So that was not a phrase that Lucy and Suzanne themselves used or invented. It was actually something that the Allies did. And that's actually kind of what's interesting about it, is that the only real parallel that I can find to what Lucy and Suzanne were doing was what the Allied PSYOPs folks were doing. There were plenty of other people writing notes to the Germans in occupied territory, and even in Nazi Germany itself. There are some famous stories of note writing, but most of the note writing that happened during the war were notes written to the other civilian population. Basically, people would write notes and say, you know, don't give up hope, you know, fight back against the Germans, you know, we can survive the war. As far as I can tell, Lucy and Suzanne were the only people that were writing notes to the Germans themselves, to the occupier, trying to demoralize them, rather than simply saying, you know, let's keep up our own morale as civilians who are going through this hard time. So, but the parallel was to what the Allies were doing as they were leafleting and dropping these paper bullets behind the lines, trying to convince German soldiers to desert or to give themselves up to the Allies. So it's a great phrase that sort of captures a bigger story in the war, but Lucy and Suzanne kind of on their own discovered how to do this and did it very well for a long time.
By the way, where you know, living on Jersey, you know, the way you describe it, it sort of has a small town feel almost. What were their relationships like with, you know, not just the soldiers, but the other people of Jersey? And was there ever a point where, you know, just maybe their friends were maybe starting to catch on to what they were doing?
Well, the question about did anybody know what they were doing? One person knew what they were doing. One friend of theirs, they'd been friends with for a number of years. They had met her on one of their vacations back in the 1920s, in fact. So she'd been a friend for a long time. She knew what they were doing, but they say in their writings, and I have no reason to believe otherwise, that no one else knew what they were doing, including their housekeeper and her husband, both of whom lived in the same house with them. It's a big enough house that they had sort of servants' quarters. So that's sort of remarkable that their housekeeper and her husband didn't have any clue what was going on. But no one else, they didn't want to involve anyone else because they didn't want to put anyone else at risk. And the one friend who did know about what was going on, they didn't involve her in this. She was not, as far as I can tell, she was not, you know, also working with them or acting on their behalf. She would just sort of understood what was, you know, kind of in a general sense what they were doing. In terms of other folks on Jersey, you know, Lucy was sort of introverted, quiet. She didn't really like to be around other people too much. Suzanne was much more sociable, but they generally kind of, I think, tended to keep to themselves. They certainly had neighbors and friends and people that they knew in the area, but I don't think they were really well known on the island. So they were kind of private, which perhaps also made it easier for them to do this work, that they, you know, they weren't such important figures or popular figures on the island that, you know, people might start to suspect them or think that they were doing something unusual. They pretty much had kept to themselves. So it gave them a sort of the perfect cover during the war.
You know, you spend a lot of time, and you've alluded to this already, about the fact that they were eventually captured and imprisoned for, I believe, the last 8 months of German occupation in Jersey. But the role of empathy and, you know, their overall experience in prison is very surprising and maybe contrary to what we'd expect of a Nazi prison, especially of two people who were trying to damage German morale on the island. Could you describe maybe what their prison experience was like? Because you say it's relatively better. You know, and obviously prison's never good, but they weren't beaten, they weren't tortured, and they were free to interact with the people around them.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because it does, as you say, it does kind of cut against our expectations from documentaries and movies and things that we see about. You know, we expect the Nazis to come in and torture them, you know, on a regular basis, and that doesn't happen, not in a physical sense, at least. I mean, I think it is important to point out that they do suffer, I think, greatly from a kind of psychological torture. Not necessarily that the Nazis are in there trying to, you know, mess with their heads, but just being in prison and not knowing what's going to happen. The Germans are executing. Usually they're executing their own soldiers. So there are other German soldiers in the prison, men who have mutinied, men who have talked about desertion, and they are being executed up until almost the end of the war. But Lucy and Suzanne, they see this going on and they hear the sounds echoing down the corridor of the wing of the prison that they're in. And it just sort of feeds their own fear and their own paranoia that this could be us. This could happen, you know, at any moment. At the moment of their arrest, one of the men comes up to them, one of the secret field police comes up to them and says something like, well, what do you think is going to happen to you now? And Lucy very flatly says, you're going to torture us and kill us. And that's, you know, even before they make it to the prison, right? Before they've undergone any interrogation. So there's kind of an expectation at every step along the way for those last 8 months that today could be the day. Any day we might end up being executed. And yet, even in the midst of that, like you say, they are actually able to form some relationships in prison, both with other prisoners, but even with the guards themselves. And in some ways, that was, to me, one of the most surprising and interesting aspects of this, is because they sort of see these men as another kind of victim, right? That they've been duped by Hitler into serving, and that they don't really want to be there. And a lot of them don't. The one guard who's sort of their primary guard, his name is Otto. That's all we know about him. We don't know anything more than just his first name, because they don't tell us anymore in their remaining sources. And he doesn't become a friend. I certainly won't say that, but he's a constant presence, and they sort of learn to talk to him, and they learn to they have a kind of working relationship with him. And there are times, especially as it gets toward the end of the war and the Germans already see, okay, this is a lost cause. This is, he begins to open the door for them, and he begins to let them go out and to talk to other prisoners, and to comfort other prisoners. And so it's a very sort of surprising and unexpected experience within the prison. And then after the war, one of the other guards, not Otto, but one of the other guards, actually writes them a letter from the POW camp where he's been in prison, and just basically says, I'm writing you a note to say I'm doing well and hello. And, and I write in the book something like, surely this is not a normal thing, that former German guards would write to the people that they had been imprisoning for months. So there are lots of twists and turns and sort of surprises in this story, certainly, that I found as I wrote it.
I mean, just about that relationship between them and the guard, these two artists, they seem to be the antithesis of everything that the Nazis stood for. How does a relationship between someone working for the Nazis and two lesbian artists, how does that happen?
Well, that's part of the sort of the almost amazing, aspect of this, is because these are people who probably would never, under normal circumstances, would never cross paths, but the war has put them together in this strange kind of scenario. I think they for most of the time in prison, they obscured their true relationship. So kind of like I said before about how they just talked about themselves as sisters, they tried very hard not to reveal the nature of their relationship, really up until the end. When they were finally put together in the same cell, the guards figured it out. But up until that point, Lucy actually was very explicit about saying that she was working hard to hide her true feelings and to hide, not to let on about their relationship, because she was worried that would become a reason that they might be executed, or they might be treated more harshly or differently. So, it's, again, I think it's one of the kind of just remarkable aspects of the story, is that these people who, as we say, would never normally meet probably in real life, in regular life, are thrown together in this remarkable situation and have to find a way to kind of make it work. By and large, they're able to kind of work that out on a day-to-day basis. And yet still lingering over all of it is that concern that, okay, even though this guard is treating me well today, is he going to shoot me tomorrow? I mean, that's still there in the back of their minds, or actually in the front of their minds, because they write about it. They're able to smuggle letters to one another in prison. And, Suzanne talks about, they talk about this in the letters, that, this could be it, we don't know. So, they're still very much aware that these men are working against them, right? That they may be friendly, but at the same time, they are also an occupation force.
We have a couple of questions, but before we get to those, because I have this opportunity, I'd like to ask, what is the significance of this this story? How can we apply it to our lives today?
You're asking me the so what question, aren't you?
Exactly.
Which I asked you many times.
Of course.
You've turned
it around.
Well, I mean, I think that there are a lot of things that I learned. Let's put it this way: a lot of things that I learned from this. One has to do with, putting World War II in a different frame. I think we don't always look at it at this sort of ground level, and I think this story really kind of reinforces, for me at least, the importance of looking at even these really huge events, these global events, looking at them at ground level and seeing who's often left out of those stories. Because I think that's another reason why we don't know this story. I think it's because they're the sort of people that we just typically don't pay attention to when it comes to a story like this. And so to be able to bring that story out is, I think, really, for me, was an important part of that. I think another reason why this matters is that I think it matters to us today because, when you think about what's happening right now in our world, there's a lot of challenges. We have some deep political polarization. We have a pandemic. Otherwise, we'd be in person, face to face, having this conversation. We have immense economic disruption. But I think that in those kind of times, sometimes we can look back to the past, we can look back to the stories of people who've gone through, in many ways, things that were far worse than what we're facing now, and still found a way to survive, still found a way to thrive, and still found a way to keep their humanity in the midst of that. I mean, I think to me, that's another part of this, is the way that Lucy and Suzanne approach this. It's a very humane approach. Brave, immensely courageous, but not falling into the kind of trap of hatred. And at least they don't admit it in their, maybe secretly somewhere in the back of their mind, they felt some kind of intense hatred. But when they talk about it, when they write about it, the sources that remain that I was able to piece together, they talk about this as a kind of, again, that's having that empathy. And so I think, to me, it's also a way to kind of think about what's the ethical challenge that we all have as we face difficult times, and can this be a kind of lesson or kind of role model in a way for thinking about some of the challenges that we face.
Well, that gets an A+ from me.
I'm glad. I value your opinion very highly, as you know.
Fantastic. So to turn to a couple of audience questions with our last, looks like 2 minutes. Where were these two women from originally?
So they were born and grew up in the city of Nantes, which is in southern France, kind of near the ocean. They were both, as I said, from wealthy families. Suzanne's father was a doctor, prominent doctor, head of the medical school in Nantes. And Lucy's father was a newspaper owner and editor. And they spent really up until their early 20s in the city of Nantes. And then only then did they move to Paris. So it was in Nantes where they had those sort of really formative experiences, like I was describing about in the aftermath of the Dreyfus affair, where people were chanting "Down with the Jews." That all happened in Nantes. And also a lot of, and they're kind of the beginnings of their relationship. I mean, it came from the fact that they'd known each other as children and grew up together. And then, by the time they were teenagers, they fell in love. And so that really was a lifelong relationship, a lifelong partnership, both personally and also artistically. The fact that Lucy's father was a newspaper editor and publisher gave them opportunities to write and to do their illustration, to do their artistic work, and he published it. So they had an outlet early on. And then when they got to Paris, like I said, they were able to kind of work some of those family connections, and that helped them too. But the roots were in Nantes, but then they left, and I'm sure they went back. I don't really know because I didn't see it in the sources, but I'm sure they went back from time to time to visit family. But by and large, their life really shifted to Paris at that point until they went on to move to Jersey.
And the other question here is, will your book appear for sale in the Channel Islands or other parts of the UK?
I certainly hope so. And I'm leaving that up to the publishers because they're the experts at selling books. But I think so. There's the book is published by a wonderful press, Algonquin, which is part of the Mighty Workman Publishing Group. And they have branches in the UK. And so I expect that it will be on sale there. I should say, by the way, if anybody's interested in purchasing a signed copy, I will be signing copies at our wonderful local bookstore here in Memphis called Novel. You can go to their website, novelmemphis.com. And if you purchase it online from Novel and you can note in the comment section, I'll be happy to even personalize it just for you. So you can just note that in the comment section. In fact, I'll be going out there next week. I've already got an appointment with them to go out and sign some books. So if you want a signed copy, that is available through novelmemphis.com. Like I said, great independent bookstore. You can, of course, find it any number of other places, including Apple Books, where it's been selected as a book of the month for November. One of the books, they have a books we love in the month of November section, so it's available there, and of course in other places too. But if you want a signed copy, that's certainly available.
Well, I couldn't have said any of that better myself. But with that, we are out of time. Thank you so much for being here virtually today to talk about the book, and thank you for inviting me to talk with you.
Well, I want to say before we sign off, thank you, Matthew, for doing this, because you were an immense help to me in writing the book and researching. You did some very important fact checking, if I remember correctly, at one crucial moment. And I thank you in the acknowledgments to the book for that hard work. And it's a great pleasure to be able to thank you as well again I know I've told you this before, but to be able to thank you for that work, but also for this great conversation tonight. There's no one I would have wanted to have this conversation with more than you. So thank you for being part of this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And I'll add one other thing. If anybody wants to hear more, I'm going to be doing a talk on Tuesday, November the 10th, which is the actual launch date of the book. You can find out more about that. It's going to be a Zoom event. You can find out more about that on the Rhodes website. Go to the calendar and click on the date, November 10th, or you can go to my website, jeffreyhjackson.com, and there's a registration link. And I'll give a sort of a more formal, semi-formal presentation with a lot more pictures, a lot more images, including a few of the images that you saw tonight. And then I'll also be taking questions as well from the audience. But it was great to have this kind of more informal conversation. But if folks want to learn more, there'll be that opportunity as well as many more opportunities. You can find out all about them on my website as well. I've got things that I'm doing all over the country, and also an event in London set up, again, all over Zoom. So people can tune in from anywhere to hear more.
All right, but other than that, thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks so much. Good night, everybody.